Okay. Well, it looks like everybody has joined that is on the call at this point. So let's get started. We've got a lot to cover this morning, and I'm really glad that everybody on the call is able to join us today. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Scott Imberman of Michigan State University, who has done some terrific work for us here at Fordham on Ohio's highest achieving students. And I know what everybody in the audience is thinking right now, especially during football season. What the heck are we doing with the Michigan State guy? But stick with me. I can promise that Ohio is well represented on our panel, and Scott has some fantastic data for us to share this morning. For those of us who are familiar with Fordham's work in Ohio, it might surprise you to hear that we have a new study about academically talented students. I mean, we're usually known for our work on standards and accountability and educational choice. But we've had a longstanding interest here at Fordham in policies that can challenge our highest achievers and ensure they have opportunities to reach their full potential. It's an economic imperative for our nation and the state of Ohio to ensure that these kids develop their special talents. And we also believe it's a moral imperative for our schools to pay attention to all students. And by all, that should include high achievers too, and especially those kids from less advantaged backgrounds. With that in mind, we commissioned Scott to undertake an analysis that helps us better understand the trajectories of Ohio's highest achieving third graders. Are they making good progress as they progress through middle school? Are they meeting important milestones in high school? And how many are going on to attend college? In the next 15 minutes, we'll hear from Scott about what the data say and what he found. He'll be walking us through the findings of his report, which is available online at Fordham's website. And after that, we'll dig in to some of the why and what's next with a great panel to follow. A few housekeeping and introductory items. So number one, the panel portion will include an audience question and answer. So feel free to use the Q&A chat box at any time to ask Scott questions or the panelists. You can also wait to ask questions via the audio feature during that segment as well. You have to, there's the raise hand button and we'll call on you and open up the audio feed and you can ask the question at that time. Secondly, I have to offer some special thanks for this project. So special thanks to the Ohio Department of Education, which provided assistance in terms of providing the data, as well as a number of reviewers who offered terrific feedback on this study throughout the drafting process. With that, I will stop talking and turn the show over to Scott, who is going to show us what he found.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it. And before I get started, I just want to say a big thank you to the Fordham Institute for sponsoring and supporting this research. It's really important research, and I really appreciate them coming to me and asking me to do this work. It was a real fun and interesting project to work on, and I'm very happy with what we accomplished here. So you know, because their time is short, let me just kind of start getting into it. So my name is Scott Imberman. I'm a professor of economics and education policy at Michigan State University. And this is a report that Ohio's Lost Einsteins, the inequitable outcomes of early high achievers. So, I'm sorry, let me move people's faces off so it doesn't cover the actual words. So what we do in this report is we consider the Ohio context and how early high achievers, which we define here as students who are in the top 20% of achievers on math or reading in third grade, how they progress through elementary school, high school, and into college. So kind of to take a nice long-term look at what happens to these early high achievers as they progress through school. And so by doing this, we're very grateful to the Ohio Department of Education and the Center for Human Resources Research for providing us with access to individual student records for all students in Ohio that allowed us to conduct this analysis. And so we have data on all students from Ohio who attended third grade between 2006 and 2012. And so these are students who are in elementary and middle school in the late 2000s. And of course, the reason we wanted to focus there is so that we can look at these longer term trends. And especially so that we have at least one cohort of students who make their way over to beyond high school and when they start enrolling in college. And so what we do is we look at trends in achievement, ACT scores, AP exams, college enrollment. And we look also importantly by differences by gender, race, economic disadvantage, and gifted identification. And finally, to wrap things up, we have an analysis that tries to estimate the impact of gifted identification on achievement in Ohio. So I'm going to go through with just a bunch of key findings. These are a subset of the findings that are in the report. There's a whole lot more in there if you want to take a closer look. For starters, a key finding one looks at achievement trends for high achievers. For students who are in third grade high achievers, their achievement stays relatively flat, maybe even drops a little bit over time if you're looking at their scale scores. While for low achievers, it increases. So we do see a bit of a narrowing of the achievement gap. But the concern that we have, that we're focusing on in this study, is not so much what's happening over here, but what's happening over here. Why, or not so much why, but kind of, you know, this looks relatively stagnant. And so we kind of want to dig deeper into the different patterns underlying this, this relatively low growth in achievement for high achievers. And so when we look by different student categories, you can see in this panel on the right, where we separate students out by whether they're disadvantaged or not disadvantaged. And we basically set everyone to zero scores, their scores at 0 in fourth grade. And we just try to look at how much achievement growth they've had over time. These are standardized scores, so these are relative to all others, to the average student. Well, these are relative to the average student. And you can see that there is a decrease in standardized score in growth, a relative decrease in growth. Keep in mind that they're still growing. This is just relative to other students. But it's bigger for the economic disadvantaged students than for the non-disadvantaged. So I don't think that you want to focus too much on where, you know, whether this is negative or the direction here, but rather the difference between the disadvantage and the non-disadvantage. And that's going to be the theme throughout the rest of this presentation. Really what we're trying to see here is what are these differences by these different student groups. If we look by race, we can see a similar pattern that's, you know, that we would expect consistent with the economic disadvantage, since minorities tend to be more economically disadvantaged. In particular, we see that Black students, Black high achievers, have considerably lower achievement growth than white and Hispanic high achievers. And all three of these groups have lower achievement growth than Asian high achievers. So there are pretty wide racial gaps in achievement growth. And these become particularly noticeable in math, so that by the time a student reaches 8th grade, they essentially have approximately, a Black student has about 500ths of the standard deviation less achievement than a white student, but approximately 2/10 of the standard deviation less achievement than an Asian student. These are all high achievers. These are all students who scored in the top 20% of achievement in 3rd grade. Next, we turn to some of these longer term outcomes, such as ACT exams. So now we're looking at students as they get into high school, and we see pretty similar patterns. Disadvantaged high achievers are substantially less likely to take an ACT exam than non-disadvantaged high achievers by a rate of 47% relative to 71%. And in particular, also of importance, if you look at racial differences, Black high achievers, only 41% of them take an ACT exam, while 68% of white high achievers and 83% of Asian Pacific Islander high achievers take ACT exams. For Hispanics, the rates are similar to Black students, but I note that there's a relatively small Hispanic population in Ohio, so these are based off a relatively small sample. If we turn to how well they perform on the exam, so this is given that they're taking the exam and there's already some students who are not taking them, we still see lower performance, particularly amongst Black students relative to white, Hispanic, and Asian students on the ACT exams. Key finding 3, we turn to advanced placement exams, and there again, there's a similar story to what we see with the ACT exams. Economic disadvantaged Black and to a lesser extent Hispanic students are considerably less likely to take AP exams, and notably Asian Pacific Islander students are substantially more likely to take AP exams. An Asian Pacific Islander student in Ohio who's an early high achiever takes an average of 2.3 exams, while a white student or early high achiever in Ohio takes an average of 0.6 exams, and a black student takes an average of 0.2. And when we look at the exam scores, again, it's a similar story. Even though there are fewer taking the exams, those who take the exams also tend to score on average lower. Turning to college enrollment, again, we see here, maybe in two-year institutions, such as community colleges, we do see less of a difference between economic disadvantage and racial groups, though notably the Black enrollment rate, Hispanic and Asian Pacific Islander rate are lower than the white rates. When we turn to four-year institutions, and the two-year institutions, one has to keep in mind is a bit of a mixed bag because some of these are people who may have been going to four-year institutions otherwise, and some of them may not have been going to college at all. But when you look at the four-year institutions, you see very wide gaps in high achieving college enrollment for Black and white students. I should note that this is data from the National Student Clearinghouse, and so this is enrollment this is able to follow students nationwide when they enroll in virtually any four-year institution in the country. And so of the high achievers, only 26% of Black students are enrolling in four-year colleges, while 57% of white students in Ohio are. And only 35% of economically disadvantaged students are enrolling, while 58% of non-disadvantaged students enroll. I should note also that this is enrollment within 2 years, so it is possible that some of these students are enrolling later on after the first 2 years after high school. Now we turn to kind of looking at patterns with gifted identification. And again, what we see here is a less likelihood to be identified when one is amongst these disadvantaged or minority groups, even given that they're in the top 20% of achievement in third grade. Now, obviously, just being in the top quartile of achievement is not enough necessarily to qualify for gifted education, and there are other factors that go into play in identifying this. But nonetheless, it is notable that within that group, with those caveats in mind, we still see these pretty substantial differences. And if I turn to if we look at by the time students are in 8th grade, of those who are in the top achievement quartile in 3rd grade of math, for economic disadvantaged students, only 34% are identified as gifted, while 53% are identified as not gifted, or I'm sorry, 53% of non-disadvantaged students are identified as gifted. Only 30% of Black and 39% of Hispanic students are identified as gifted, while 52% of white and 71% of Asian Pacific Islanders are. Now, I also want to note that during this time period, when we're studying them, Ohio did not yet have universal gifted and talented screening, which they do now. So it is possible, and this is maybe something to consider for the panel later on in terms of what to think about and additional where to go from here. It is possible that the universal screening programs have reduced these gaps in the interim. Also, I would note that now I'm going to turn away from the demographic differences and look at the differences for gifted students who are high achievers, who are identified as gifted and who are not. And I want to caution that these are not necessarily causal. These are just showing descriptive patterns. And they are in some ways what we would expect, that those identified as gifted would tend to perform better than those who don't. It's notable, though, again, that the difference in these achievement scores and these ACT-SAT scores are actually quite large. For example, when you look at, this is the Ohio graduation test, which I believe is now defunct, but at the time was common. Correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron. But at the time, this was a test that students had to take in high school in order to graduate from from high school. And pass it, and students who were in any GT program tended to score about 0.4 of a standard deviation higher in math than those high achievers who were not GT. Once again, we see similar patterns when we look at AP exams, and to a lesser extent, maybe for college, particularly when you look at four-year college enrollment, you do see GT identified students are more likely to enroll in college than non-GT identified early high achievers. Finally, we get to the measures that I would say under certain reasonable assumptions would be viewed as causal. to kind of see what is the actual impact of gifted and talented education on students' achievement. These use what we call a fixed effects method. And the idea here is that it accounts for any factors that do not change over time. So things like a student's innate ability or their, their personality, aspects of the personality that don't change. What it does not account for is things that do change over time. So for example, if students kind of exhibit, growth in their ability or kind of changes in their personality over time, that could still lead to some potential bias in the estimates, but it does not account for that. But our argument here is that this at least will get us closer to what we think is actually the true impact of gifted and talented education in Ohio, or specifically gifted and talented identification, since we're only looking at the identification margin on student performance. And the blue bars here, the ones that are blue, are statistically significant results. The non-blue bars are not statistically significant. You'll notice that in most cases, being identified in a GT category does have a positive estimated effect on math and reading, though notably only gifted identification for cognitive or math skills makes us statistically significant. Interestingly, this also applies for the reading test, where there's actually not that much of an impact of being classified as a strong reader for GT on actual reading achievement. It does seem to come out of math, which suggests maybe comes out something more broader base underlying student performance. However, I would note that these are relatively modest. This amounts to a 3/100th of a standard deviation improvement in achievement per year. You can think of that as being approximately equivalent to, maybe on the range of like 1 percentile point in that range. Now, it's possible that over time this accumulates. I'm not able to look at whether these kind of add up over time. This is just a 1-year impact, but nonetheless, it still is a relatively small, but still positive impact on student achievement. One thing notable here is that if we look separately by different student characteristics, the achievement effects are substantially larger for Black students. Now, I would say that this is merely suggestive in the sense that whether or not it's bigger for Black or for white and other races, because the estimate is, as you can see by these bars, which show you the confidence interval there, these estimates are quite a bit noisier. However, if you take them at face value, you see an estimate that the impact of GT on math achievement for Black students is particularly large, approximately 1/10 of a standard deviation, which over the course of, say, 3 or 4 years may amount to 2, 3, 4/10 of a standard deviation, which is a sizable increase in achievement. Typically, education interventions that we consider to be effective are those that increase achievement by roughly this size, about 1/10 of a standard deviation. So there is, I think, something I would say suggestive and interesting here, and maybe deserves further study about what is happening with regards to the impacts of GT for minority students. As you can see, we also get a similar estimate for Hispanic students, but since there are very few Hispanic students, we can't get a really precise number there. So in conclusion, the study finds that early high achievers who are underrepresented minorities or economically disadvantaged perform worse on multiple metrics compared to other early high achievers. Early high achievers who are identified for gifted and talented services perform better than other early high achievers on long run outcomes. And again, I should note this is just identification, so we don't know whether the students actually receive those services. These are correlational rather than causal results. So while they reflect true patterns, they may not reflect a policy impact of GT identification. However, more plausibly causal results show improvements in 4th to 8th grade achievement that are particularly strong for Black early high achievers. So, thank you very much. And I'll turn it back to Aaron.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott, for terrific presentation, really walk through the data. Again, there's a lot more in the report itself that you can check out on Fordham's website. It goes in depth on all of these analyses that he did. At this time, I want to shift gears a little bit. So we're going to bring in a terrific all-star panel to talk a little bit more about what we think is going on behind the scenes with some of these data. why we're seeing these patterns, and also discuss, what schools and state policymakers could do moving forward to try to improve outcomes for all kids. So I will let Scott stay on, and he'll be on the panel and he can jump in as well. Please do ask questions in the Q&A chat box. You can do that, or you can raise your hand and ask a question through the audio, and we'll do that throughout the panel discussion. I'll introduce the panel right now very quickly. The first panelist is Dr. Donna Ford of Ohio State University. Dr. Ford is an expert in gifted and talented programs and has done some very extensive research, especially on gifted education for minority children. Tina Kimbrough of the Nord Family Foundation. Tina is the Education Program Officer for the Nord Foundation, an Ohio-based philanthropy that especially works with communities in Northeast Ohio. We're very happy that Tina could join us. Thirdly, we have Maria Lohr of the Ohio Department of Education. She is the Assistant Director of Gifted Education. And lastly, we have Ann Sheldon of the Ohio Association for Gifted Children, an organization that advocates on behalf of Ohio's gifted children. I want to offer special thanks to Ann for helping to co-host this event and organize the panel. It was really great working together in terms of putting this together. Scott will also actually be presenting, I believe, at a conference in October with the Gifted Association, so please check that out as well. All right, that is who is on the panel, and feel free again to put in questions. I'll start with kick it off with a couple prepared questions for the panel, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. So first, this is to everyone. We can start in maybe in alphabetical order by first name. So Ann, I guess you can go first, and we'll go around the horn. So there's a lot going on in Scott's report that's worth reflection and comment, but what was one thing that stood out to you? And I'll emphasize one thing to keep it brief, that stood out to you from his findings. Any surprises, any things that we should especially see and take away?
Thanks, Aaron. Honestly, the whole report was largely unsurprising to me. We've been tracking from our organization and reporting data on this issue for as long as we've been able to get the data from the department, and it's uniformly been bad in terms of those achievement gaps between economically disadvantaged and not economically disadvantaged in certain minority populations and others. If there was, and honestly, this is why in the report card reform bill that was just passed in June, we really pushed, along with the help of Fordham Foundation, Ohio Excels, and several other groups, to include more information about the identification and service to economically disadvantaged and minority, underrepresented minority populations, because we feel that that's a hugely important thing, just to shine a brighter light on what's not going on for those groups. If there was one surprise, it was a teeny tiny little thing at the end, and it was about the statistic about Asian Pacific Islander college enrollment rates, which were slightly lower than that of white students. And I'll probably, when Scott comes to our conference in October, I'll probably corner him to ask more about that, because that did really surprise me a bit.
Excellent. All right, kick it over to Donna.
Well, thank you for having me on this panel, and I appreciate the report. I want to echo almost everything that Ann just said. And for me, the data were not surprising. They were still disappointing and inequitable, unjust. When I think about the report, it's another reminder that we are in not just a COVID pandemic, but a racial or racist and classist pandemic. No matter where you look throughout the United States and the world, including Ohio, Black, Hispanic, and low-income students are not doing well. And the most disappointing information for me is that when we start off as high achievers, that top 20%, that we fall. And so we don't sustain that. So we certainly have to interrogate what happens in schools and homes to make that happen. There's just so much that needs to be said about what needs to happen. So no surprises, more reinforcement, more of a sense of urgency to make changes, equitable changes.
Yeah, and I can't wait to talk a little bit more about what we can do moving forward. Maria, go ahead and give us your takeaway from the report.
First, I just want to say thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I think, similar to what Donna and Anne, have previously mentioned, I think more than anything, this report just backs up a lot of the data that we have already been looking at and analyzing and seeing those patterns, that we've been looking at over time in identification, access to service, those types of things here with the department and the work that we're doing with the Gifted Advisory Council. So to me, this report just really kind of backs up and is further evidence for us to continue our work of looking at this and trying to identify strategies, policies, et cetera, that we can really kind of focus in on to help move the needle forward and improve outcomes for our students.
All right, so no surprises yet. Tina, you have to give us a big surprise that you saw in the report.
Yes, I'll try. I agree with all the other panelists. I think the report touched on so many great points, lots of things we knew, but having the data available to everyone is so important. But I think what stood out to me the most was the low percentage of low-income Black and Hispanic students in gifted programs. And I say this because the report goes on to talk about how students who are identified as gifted perform better than non-gifted students who are also high achievers on all the long-term outcomes, right? So advanced placement, ACT, SAT testing, and attending and graduating from college. So yes, for me, that's what stood out the most. I wasn't surprised about it, but just having that data was just super helpful. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. It is sort of like a paradox where they're seem to be under-identified, but yet they benefit the most. The economically disadvantaged and the Black and Hispanic students. I'll give one quick surprise. What's interesting, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal about this a couple weeks ago about college enrollment rates by gender. And I hadn't realized that the enrollment rates, the split between males and females, that become 40-60, 40 on the male side and 60 on the female side. I hadn't realized it'd become that unbalanced. And what you see in Scott's report, there's not a huge focus on gender generally throughout. But males and females do stack up pretty evenly on most of the metrics, but then all of a sudden you look on college enrollment rates and, females outperform significantly, quite considerably compared to males. So that's something, we haven't done a lot of work in that area as in education reform. It's not typically a point of conversation, but it's something that is interesting and surprising and maybe a point of discussion moving forward. Okay, I want to direct a couple questions to Anne and Donna at this point. So these data do seem to suggest that we need in Ohio to work on expanding opportunities for high achieving kids. So what does that look like? Should we be identifying more students as gifted and talented, or encourage more participation in these advanced courseworks, advanced options for students? And if so, how do we do that without lowering standards or making things worse? So I'll direct that to either Anne or Donna to respond.
Donna's the expert, so I'm going to let her go first, and then I'll follow up.
Thanks for the compliment. Well, I really get bothered by the phrase and dumbing down when it comes to addressing underrepresented students who face so many inequities. So, and to make recommendations that are culturally responsive and economically responsive should not be viewed as dumbing down anything. We talk about national norms, then there's group norms, but we need to, in the school districts, also talk about building norms. I want to know, in your school building, not just your district, but in your school building, how are you performing relative to other students who are similarly situated? Because for the most part, and of course there are exceptions, low-income students are in schools and buildings with other low-income students. Data indicate Black students tend to be in schools with Black students. All right, so we need to make not just group comparisons, we need to make building comparisons. And it is equitable to make changes in the spirit of advocacy for underrepresented groups. And so equity means the needs are different, the situations are different, so we need to do something different that is not dumbing down, and is not a zero-sum game either, where when we make changes that are equitable, and I know we're going to talk about those changes, but changes that are equitable for underrepresented students, for students who face discrimination of all kinds, it is not unjust to take that on, and we are not taking anything away from more affluent students. So, and I guess the last thing is, there would not be such a desperation for affluent families, in particular, white affluent families, Asian affluent families, to get their children into gifted programs if the general ed curriculum, if the core curriculum were more rigorous. So people think the only way you can get rigor is to be in gifted programs. That is a shame, and it needs to be addressed. So much more to say, but I will stop.
I need to echo what Donna said about the second part of the question about dumbing down programs. I think I have in my notes because some of the questions were shared in advance. I think I put cringeworthy. I hate the insinuation that if you allow more kids into services, that it necessarily dumbs down what's happening for those services. Do we maybe need to address those students' need differently? Sure. But is that dumbing things down? I don't think so. In Ohio, we are encumbered by a couple of different policies that make things much more difficult to identify economically disadvantaged and underrepresented minority students. First of all, we are required to use national norms to identify gifted students. And I will say that from talking with gifted coordinators from around the state, local and building norms are not the entire answer. It won't do anything in high wealth districts. I'll just share that right off the bat. If you're looking at, say Olentangy local or Worthington, probably none of those things will change in terms of providing better access to gifted services for those students. But there are a number of other things that we could and should be doing. We should look at some local norms and building norms in certain situations where we think that there might be some benefit to expand the pool. We need to do a better job of ensuring that universal screening that's on the books in Ohio, it's a fairly new policy. We need to ensure that that is being implemented with integrity at the district level. Because I know from anecdotal data, from things that I'm hearing from the field, that there are a lot of districts that are trying to skirt that universal screening, which is, just a shame. We also need to do something, I think, that's called front loading, looking at talent development for kids who might not be identified as gifted initially, but really do have potential, and working with those kids early on so that they can progress. I think that has real potential. I'd like to see a lot more of that in Ohio's districts. I'd like to see, when we redo the gifted performance indicator, that we really hit hard those policies of shining the light on identification and service of minority kids and economically disadvantaged kids. We need to do a better job of looking at different screening tools. And finally, I think we probably need to do a better job of providing classroom teachers with some basic education and how to maybe view their students a little bit differently. So maybe they don't pigeonhole all their kids as the gifted kid is the one who's teacher pleasing. It very well might be that kid in the back row that's causing all the trouble for you. So these are the things that there's a host of things we can throw at this problem. I think we need to throw it all out there, because what we're doing is just not working, when what we're doing is essentially nothing.
Let me very quickly follow up with Ann, and thank you, Ann. Just 3 quick points. One, as I was reading the report, I kept thinking that we should have been, and Ann just said this, in a different way, looking earlier at our students, not just 3rd grade, because there's data, they talk about the 3rd grade, I think it's called the 3rd grade syndrome among Black students in particular, whereby then, just when we're identifying students as gifted, like the 3rd grade, we are starting to underachieve, lose interest in school. The second point I wanted to say is I am all for universal screening, but universal screening, we have to look at what instruments are being used. Are they culturally responsive or biased? What our cutoff score, what our criteria, even for screening. And we need to get, for screening, cast a wide net. And then the 3rd one is we need to stop using the word identification and talk about assessment, which is more thorough. And also we need to talk about what are we doing to recruit more underrepresented students in gifted programs, as well as to retain them.
Oh, can I just follow up with one more thing, Erin, if you don't mind? The other big policy hole in Ohio is that we don't mandate gifted services. So what we see are wealthy districts that provide and lower wealth districts that don't. So automatically you're going to see a huge disparity in what happens for kids who are attending, lower wealth districts, and that just has to be addressed if we're going to address the issue of equity and gifted education in Ohio. Okay, I'll shut up now.
And that is certainly a little bit of an irony that we formally identify students as gifted and then don't necessarily require them to receive any special services. So I want to turn the next question to Tina, who works with communities and in philanthropy. So how can nonprofits be valuable partners in talented development for these high achieving students? What types of initiatives are you seeing in your communities? And what roles can philanthropy play to support high achieving students?
Thank you, Erin. So in many of the communities that the North Family Foundation serves, there are a lot of efforts supporting low performing students and improving their academics, but not nearly enough effort supporting high achievers. I believe a collaborative approach is needed here. I have seen a lot more collaboration amongst districts and nonprofits and philanthropy to push college access and having career coaches in high schools, which is great. And we need more of this. But these services need to be extended into the middle schools and even elementary schools. And I know Donna just kind of touched on this. And I think that's a place where philanthropy can come in and partner with districts. I think starting college access programs in high school can be too late in some cases, especially amongst those early high achievers that were not identified for gifted programs. And that is why focusing on high achievers sooner rather than later is so important. I think getting students, especially low-income Black or Hispanic students, engaged and thinking long-term outcomes and not just now is just so important. I also think family involvement is key. I have seen community-based organizations such as Rise Colorado, one of our grantee partners in Denver, really change school communities by focusing on educating, engaging, and empowering low-income families and families of color to become their own change agents and fight for their child's education. I think here in Ohio, there is a need to educate families and give them tools to navigate the system. I think a lot of parents don't know that they can advocate and fight for their kids. And so making sure that they have the tools and resources to do so is just so important. And then lastly, I think philanthropy can also support organizations that focus on policy reform. So I believe philanthropy can help on both ends, on the ground, partnering with school districts and nonprofits, but also focusing on policy change as well to make sure that these students aren't being forgotten.
That's excellent. And I want to add, there's a question in the chat box, but I want to throw out a question for the group as well, because Tina mentioned it. And this is a question that I had sort of in my own mind is, how can parents be really good advocates for their own children and make sure that, especially without a requirement for schools to actually serve students who are gifted or otherwise high achieving. What are some good ways that you've seen in terms of parents being involved in their own kids' education and advocacy? And are there any things that might backfire in terms of that, that some potholes that parents should be aware of? So I'll throw that out there in terms of just how parents can be engaged in their own kids' education.
Well, I want to echo what Tina just said. And I know we all are saying that, but that's why we're on this panel, because we really do dig into the injustices and we want change. I work with school districts a lot. And unfortunately, when it comes to minoritized students, in particular Black and Hispanic students, and just in general, students who live in poverty, they are often clueless about the existence of gifted programs and advanced placement programs, because like their children, or like these children in the data, they don't have access to get the program. They know a hell of a lot about special education and discipline, but little to nothing about gifted and talented programs. So outreach efforts really need to be sincere and relevant to the needs of these families. So like, when are you holding meetings? Are you requiring families to come to meetings at a certain time? Where are the meetings being held? Do you, if it's in the evening, do you provide meals, and can families bring their children? Are you sending the messages? Are you working with the community so that they know about gifted programs and can partner with you, and so much more? But the bottom line is, you can't advocate for something you don't know. White affluent parents know a hell of a lot about gifted programs, about testing, and about who to go to for school, which school psychologist to go to for assessments, learning about the assessments, getting copies of the assessments, getting getting the tests themselves and more. So there's a lot of, sometimes it's illegal to me, things that are taking place with wealthy families. It reminds me of the college admission scandal. We have that in gifted education. So the haves have a lot and the have-nots have nothing. What are you going to do to truly be responsive to those families who are clueless? Last, I want to say this. I have a lot of Black colleagues in the field of gifted education. I'm not going to name them here, but they are top Black people in gifted education. And they and we have had to fight for our children to be identified as gifted. So it's not just an economic issue, it's a racist issue. We have Black professors whose children aren't being identified as gifted. And so we gotta really take on those injustices, those realities.
Can I follow up just with I definitely couldn't have stated any better than Donna has in terms of the lack of access and information for parents, particularly those of minority students. I started out as a parent advocate for gifted. That's where I cut my teeth. I don't come at my role from an education perspective at all. And what I have found throughout the years is, number one, knowledge is critical. And that's what Donna really referred to in her comments, is that you can't properly advocate for your kids unless you know how the system works. So that is really critically important. What I tell parents when pre-COVID, when I was able to speak to parents in person, is that, number one, you have to be knowledgeable about how the system works. You need to know the state laws. You need to know what's happening in your district. There are power in numbers. Parents who join together as a group often have much better success than trying to fight the system one by one as an individual parent. I know from the Q&A that OAGC's parent division chair is on this webinar. So I'm going to give a little plug to her and the work that she's been trying to do both at Columbus City Schools and for OAGC. And I'm also going to give a plug to our parent day that we will have attached to the fall conference. It's free to everybody. It's virtual. It will be recorded so anyone can listen to it, after the fact. There is no magic bullet in terms of parent advocacy other than you need to do it. And it is just really so much more difficult if you don't have the tools, and that's knowledge of the system, knowledge of the laws. We need to have districts help out in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's.
Let me just add this. I'm sorry, Aaron.
Yeah,
And stop giving me other ideas. But when I was reading the report, I want to just recommend, I want everyone to listen to this. Let's stop using the term family involvement. That is white and Eurocentric and it captures more the status of white families. When we're talking about children who live in poverty and minoritized individuals, we are more collective in terms of culture, and we need to use the term family involvement. When I was a single mom raising my son, I was in school. My mother was taking care of my son to the point where he was calling me Donna and her grandma. Then I knew I had to calling me Donna and her mom. And I knew I had to make some changes. Now I gave birth to you. I'm your mom. But I can never thank my mother enough for stepping in. So we, Black and Hispanics, have the most collective and more expansive notions of family called fictive kinship. So we need to involve extended family members. We need to involve neighbors who we often call like Aunt Donna, and we're not even related. So family involvement, family engagement, it should be, equitable. And take that in consideration.
Yep.
Family involvement.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, and Maria, maybe I'll direct this question to you, is I believe under Ohio state law that if a family is not receiving gifted services from their school, they should actually get a letter from their school saying that we're not providing special services. Is that true? And can you speak a little bit to that and what the department does to try to ensure that families are getting information?
Right. So that was one of the things that, I was sitting here thinking about as everyone was talking. We have done a lot recently in the past couple of years to help increase transparency, because as both Donna and Ann pointed out, and Tina too, if people aren't aware, then they don't know how to advocate, what to advocate for, or even, who they need to talk to at the districts and in their schools. So we've done a lot to try to increase transparency. So specifically what you were mentioning is what we refer to as a no service letter. So if a student is identified, but they are not provided any service, then the school district is to send home a letter to the families to notify them, to let them know your student's identified, but they are not receiving services. And kind of on the other side of that, for students who do receive service, districts are required to make an attempt to get a parent signature on the written education plan, which is what guides gifted service in Ohio. So, things like that to help make it more transparent between families and the home of what's happening in school and what's happening for that student. Because, that's one thing that, we know about too, is sometimes parents don't even realize that, they think, well, my student's gifted, so they must be getting something. There must be some service that's happening at school. So sometimes they're not even aware. So just anything to help kind of increase that transparency, baby steps.
Excellent. We have a question in the chat box, and we're sort of running out of time. So if you're in the audience and you have a question you want to ask, this is the time to do it. This is probably a question for Scott related to a study. The study, they're curious if Dr. Imberman is able to look at the relationship between gifted service on outcomes. To what degree are the low-income minority students less likely to be served, and what role might that play in explaining the findings? So I'll turn that one to Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. So unfortunately, we weren't able to look at this directly, but I think that the point, the questioner is spot on, that it could very well be that differential, not just differential identification, but differential receipt of services, even conditional identification, could be playing a pretty substantial role here. And that's, I think, an open question that I think does really need to be answered, particularly given how much variation there is in service provision across districts in Ohio. And I'll toss out a Michigan thing there too, because I think Michigan's kind of the same way. I've noticed there's a lot of variation in whether or not districts offer gifted services. My district, in fact, does not, which has been a bit of a frustration, for me as well. And so I think that could be an explanation. I hope that be able to kind of dig more in to see that.
Excellent. No other questions from the audience. We have a quiet audience. I know there's people out there, but okay. So I guess
Aaron, can I interrupt you again?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, I'm sorry. Scott, thank you. Okay, Scott, thank you for your comments. And Ann said this earlier, but I want to say it in a different way. I think it's absolutely asinine and hypocritical, to say the least, that any state would mandate services and not provide funding. We know who is going to benefit racially and economically, and who is not. I mean, it's irrational that you would say, oh, here we have these programs, and families get a letter saying, but your child will get no services. I mean, what message does that send to families about valuing gifts and talents? So I know policy is a major issue. We damn sure need to start with that one. Mandated services, mandated funding, period.
Yeah. And Ann, I think there are some changes in the last budget around gifted education. So could you touch on that very quickly?
There sure are, and most of them are positive for a change. First of all, with the whole school funding formula changes, there were a lot of changes for the gifted education funding formula. And one of the things is the salary has increased from the 1970s minimum teacher salary schedule, which was being used to provide funding, to a salary schedule or amounts that were from 2018, which is, a pretty big change for funding. But the thing that I'm most excited about is that there was a provision put in the budget that indicates finally that certain districts need to use gifted funding provided by the state to actually provide services, identification, professional development for gifted students. You would think that this would be a no-brainer, that state funding for gifted would be used on gifted students, but until this provision, that has not been the case. So I'm absolutely thrilled to see that change. Maria might have some other things she would like to share about some of the changes in the budgets as well. But for me, that was a huge and very welcome change. Oh, one other thing, some of the data that OAGC posts on our website every year is about the different types of services and supports that each district have for gifted students. And now ODE will be providing that data. And that's great because it shouldn't come from an outside organization. ODE should be looking at all of that data and putting that out there in a very transparent way so that families and community members who are supporting gifted students could look at each district and say, oh, well, you're providing services, but you only have one gifted intervention specialist for 10,000 students. What kind of services are you actually providing? You know, all of those pieces are important. So, and I'll let Maria have a word too, because I think she shared some things last week at the Gifted Advisory Council.
Right. So the latest budget bill that passed in July, we have seen some positive changes for gifted education. As Ann mentioned, having kind of explicit language there now that says that gifted funds that are provided by the state shall be spent on gift identification services, professional development for teachers in gifted education. And that's a new category for funding in this budget bill is professional development money for our general education teachers who provide gifted services. So districts, will see money in that category, and then also some changes there for identification funding as well. So increases in the K-6 for K-6 students for those whole grade screenings to provide some increased funding there, and then also additional dollars K-12 for referrals. So money, kind of dedicated more towards identification, professional development, those types of things. So I think all of those are positives.
Yeah, that's excellent. So some really good step forwards happening in terms of funding and accountability for that funding as well. We are running out of time, so I'm going to do a lightning round and let the rest of our panel kind of have, we'll say 30 seconds to 60 seconds if you can keep it to that. One final word on, if you could pick one policy or practice that would really, you think is the most promising in terms of what people in this audience should think about moving forward, that we should advocate for to improve the education of high achievers, what would that be? And why do you think that? So very quickly, and we'll go in reverse order this time and start with Tina and go back the other way around.
So I would say funding. I think that schools need to have the resources to be able to provide these things. And I know in the chat, a lot of people said funding for professional development and talent. And so I think that making sure that schools actually have the resources that they need to be able to actually have plans in place for these students. I know Ann mentioned that some districts don't use the funding for gifted programs, even though it's supposed to be for gifted programs. So just making sure that there's accountability there as well, and making sure that these funds are being used for what they're supposed to be used for.
All right, Maria.
I think for me, it's early and continuous access. So anything that we can do that's going to increase access for our students, and that makes it not a one-shot deal, that there's as they are progressing through school at various grade levels, that there are multiple entry points for those students to enter into services and things of that nature.
So, okay, so it's me. So yes to what my two other panelists, our two other panelists have said. So I want to just go ahead then and focus on training and professional development. In higher education, we need to have more programs where, aspiring teachers or current teachers can get training to work with gifted students, and the same with professional development. But it must not be through a color or culture blind lens. We need training. Teachers need to be trained also to be culturally responsive. And digging even deeper, we need teachers to have anti-racist training. Let's be blunt and bold about it. Then last, and I'm just going to drop this bomb, we need to stop teacher and parent teacher referrals in particular, because every study shows they underrefer Black, almost every study shows they underrefer Hispanics, and almost every study shows they underrefer low-income students, but they always underrefer Blacks. Stop teachers being the gatekeeper.
I guess I'm last here. I support everything that everybody else has said. I don't have a lot more to add. I think if there were one policy change that I would like to see implemented in Ohio before I retire someday is I just would love to see a gifted service mandate. I think it is critical in terms of implementing everything that we've talked about, that we acknowledge that this is the only student subgroup in Ohio that we look at and have decided, oh, well, we don't actually need to provide services for their particular needs. That to me is bordering on immoral at this point. So that's the huge change that I would like to see happen.
Okay, well, that is the last word. I'll give mine, and it takes 15 seconds. I would love to see, more access to advanced placement programs for all students. I think they're tremendous opportunities, and the IB program as well, although it's less utilized here in Ohio. For myself, it was a tremendous opportunity. I thought those were the best courses in high school. They pushed from personal experience myself more than any of the other classes, and I think it'd be great to see more of that expanded. Scott, I want to thank you for taking the time this morning to present the findings. It's an excellent report. Take a look at it on Fordham's website. And his slide deck should be online as well as a resource. And the video will be posted, I believe, too. And thanks everybody to the panel and for everyone who joined us. And with that, I will close the program.
Thank you, everyone.